In a world where kings were supposed to be larger than life, draped in majesty and adorned with divine favor, one ruler stood apart not because of his power or his triumphs, but because of the grotesque spectacle of his very existence. From the day he was born, whispers echoed through the stone halls of his castle, for the infant who should have been the pride of the dynasty emerged into the world with a body so twisted and a face so misshapen that even the midwives recoiled in horror, murmuring prayers under their breath, as if evil itself had crept into the royal bedchamber. And as he grew, so too did the deformities that marked him, his spine bent into a crooked arch, his jaw jutting forward unnaturally, his skin pale and blotched like parchment left too long in dampness, and his eyes mismatched in colour and size, giving him a gaze that unsettled even his closest attendants. In an age when every blemish was read as a divine sign, people believed his hideous appearance was proof of a curse, a punishment inflicted upon his family for secret sins, and the rumours spread like wildfire that he was bewitched, that sorcery had touched his bloodline, or worse, that he was never truly human at all but a monster in regal disguise. Courtiers, who outwardly bowed and flattered, privately mocked him, crafting cruel songs that likened him to demons from Scripture, while peasants refused to look upon his face, fearing that his very gaze could bring disease or misfortune. And yet he was still a king draped in silks and gold, seated upon a throne that seemed to mock his twisted frame, ruling a kingdom that whispered of his curse behind every closed door. Historians record that his every public appearance was a grotesque spectacle, with mothers clutching their children tightly to their sides, as if his shadow might seep into their blood, while priests debated whether his body was a warning from God or evidence that the devil himself had found a place upon the throne. And this belief shaped his reign as much as any law or decree he ever passed, for he lived not just as a man but as an omen, a walking embodiment of terror and superstition. His every gesture watched for signs of black magic, his every word weighed as though it carried the stench of the infernal. Yet what made his story truly haunting was not merely his monstrous appearance, but the way it consumed his destiny, for his court became a place of fear and suspicion, where enemies did not need to raise armies to undermine him. They needed only to point at his crooked body, his misshapen skull, and his ghastly visage to whisper that he was cursed, and in a world already drowning in paranoia, the people were all too ready to believe it. In the candle-lit halls of his palace, tapestries could not hide the crooked silhouette of their master, and so the king's life became a tale of shadows, where power, fear, and deformity wove together into a legend so grotesque that centuries later he is remembered not for his decrees or his battles, but for the chilling belief that his very flesh was proof of a curse, a living nightmare enthroned before a trembling world. His appearance alone might have been enough to strike fear and revulsion into the hearts of his people, but the true horror of this king's reign was how the belief in his supposed curse began to shape the destiny of his kingdom itself. For in an age when science was little more than superstition, dressed in ritual, every drought, every famine, every plague was laid at his feet, with subjects whispering that the land withered because their monarch's soul was rotten, and that heaven itself was punishing them for allowing such a figure to rule. The peasants watched their crops fail under unrelenting sun and swore they saw the king's crooked shadow stretch across the fields, withering grain where it touched, while midwives blamed stillborn children on his gaze, claiming that the moment he looked upon expectant mothers, unseen demons stirred in their wombs, twisting life into death. Nobles, ever eager to consolidate power, quietly fueled these suspicions, telling stories of nights when the king's chambers echoed with unnatural cries, of mirrors that cracked when he walked past, of dogs that howled and cowered whenever he entered a room. And while such stories may have been nothing more than convenient lies, in a kingdom drowning in fear they became accepted truth, so much so that even the clergy, who should have defended him as God's anointed, began to preach sermons hinting that perhaps his deformities were signs of divine wrath, a message from heaven that the crown had been sullied. This isolation drove the king into darker paths, for surrounded by whispers and accusations he sought solace not in his court, but in forbidden texts, alchemists, and charlatans who promised him relief from his disfigurements. And though none could truly alter the crooked lines of His body, their poisons and potions twisted his health further, leaving him even more grotesque than before. His skin yellowed, his teeth blackened, his breath foul with the stench of rotting herbs and mercury. As his body decayed, so too did his mind, for he began to embrace the very identity that others had forced upon him, no longer denying the whispers of curses but leaning into them, surrounding himself with astrologers, sorcerers, and omens, making decisions not by counsel or law but by the stars, the flight of birds, or the blood patterns of sacrificed animals, until the affairs of state were no longer guided by reason but by ritual soaked in fear. Under his cursed reign, executions multiplied, for he believed traitors lurked in every corridor, and the heads of innocents rolled in the mud as warnings against those who doubted him. Yet this only deepened the belief that he was not a king at all but a monster cloaked in gold, whose hideous face was the reflection of a hideous soul. In time, rebellion simmered not because of hunger or oppression alone, but because the people genuinely believed that removing him from the throne was the only way to lift the curse that had settled over the land, and his downfall became inevitable, not by sword or siege, but by the crushing weight of superstition that had turned his very existence into a blight upon the kingdom. A man whose physical deformity became the instrument of his own undoing, cementing his legacy as a cursed monarch whose grotesque appearance doomed not only himself, but every life under his crown. The downfall of the king who was believed to be cursed did not come suddenly, like a blade striking in the night, but slowly, as fear eroded the foundations of his rule. For once the nobility realized that the common people's hatred of his twisted body and terrifying visage outweighed their fear of his crown, they began to weave a web of betrayal around him, whispering promises of salvation to the masses if only the cursed monarch were removed. And these whispers spread like fire in dry grass, becoming rumors that his very blood carried darkness, that to spill it would be to cleanse the kingdom of the devil's mark. As rebellion smouldered, the king retreated deeper into his fortress, surrounding himself with relics, charms, and grotesque idols, meant to shield him from unseen forces, yet in truth they only made him seem more monstrous, his chambers becoming a grotesque shrine of fear with walls hung in talismans, jars filled with the organs of sacrificed animals, and the stench of incense heavy enough to choke the air, so that even loyal servants began to whisper of witchcraft. His paranoia swelled until he trusted no one, not even his family, and when his closest adviser dared suggest reforms to ease the suffering of the starving peasants, he accused them of conspiring with demons. Their executions carried out in public squares, where mothers clutched their children and muttered prayers against the curse that seemed to have infected even the air. Yet what sealed his fate was not rebellion or treason, but a single famine that stretched across the land, shriveling crops and blackening fields. For while other kingdoms suffered the same misfortune, his subjects believed it was his cursed presence alone that had invited such wrath from heaven, and when starving peasants died in ditches by the hundreds, their families cursed not nature but the king himself, swearing that the land would never heal until his hideous shadow was lifted from the throne. Desperate and broken, the nobles finally acted, dragging him from his palace under cover of darkness and locking him in a dungeon where his screams echoed through stone corridors, a wretched sound that chilled even his captors, for though they despised him, there was something almost inhuman in the anguish of his cries, as if he truly were a cursed creature clawing at the edges of life. When at last he died, some said his body twisted further in death, his jaw unhinged grotesquely, his crooked limbs frozen in shapes that made priests recoil, and his burial was carried out in secret, hidden from the eyes of the people who demanded proof of his destruction. For the nobles feared that even his corpse might spread terror, that if the people saw his monstrous face in death, they would believe the curse lived on. But death did not end the story, for legends sprang like weeds in wake of his passing, tales of a wailing spirit wandering the ruins of his palace, of livestock dropping dead whenever his burial site was approached, of shadows flickering at night shaped like his hunched silhouette. And so the curse that had defined his life outlived him, For the people believed that evil cannot die with flesh, that some horrors are eternal, and thus he became immortal not through triumph or glory, but through fear, remembered as the king whose hideous appearance condemned his soul to a legacy of darkness that no crown could erase. The years following the cursed king's death should have brought peace, yet instead they were plagued with unease, for the nobles who had orchestrated his downfall found themselves unable to silence the ghostly whispers that spread across taverns, marketplaces, and even monasteries, whispers that claimed the king was not truly dead, but had clawed his way out of the grave to exact vengeance, and these stories were fed by strange occurrences that seemed too frequent to dismiss as mere coincidence. Farmers swore that crops closest to the hidden burial ground withered overnight. Shepherds reported flocks panicking at moonlight shadows, and entire villages claimed to hear a dragging sound across cobblestones, as though something deformed and heavy shuffled through the night. Priests attempted to calm the hysteria by declaring that the curse had been buried with his body, but even they faltered when reports surfaced of blood seeping through the earth at the site of his tomb, a dark ooze that stained the grass red and carried a smell so foul that travelers swore it turned their stomachs for days, and when rain fell, locals claimed it washed the blood downhill into rivers, spreading the taint further until fish floated lifeless at the surface, fueling belief that the cursed king's body poisoned the very land. Terrified, the nobles tried to relocate his corpse, secretly exhuming the grave, but when they opened the coffin, what they found made even the bravest among them recoil. His body had not decayed like ordinary men, but had twisted further, skin leathery and stretched, jaw locked open in a grotesque scream, eyes sunken yet glinting faintly as if some malevolent spark remained, and one chronicler wrote that the stench was not of death but of sulphur, like the air of hell itself, forcing them to flee without daring to rebury him. Instead, they abandoned the coffin in a sealed crypt beneath a ruined monastery, hoping that stone and prayer would bind the curse, but word leaked, and soon the common people whispered that their rulers had angered forces far beyond their control, unleashing not just a cursed king, but a vengeful spirit determined to torment the kingdom until his name was worshipped rather than erased. This paranoia reshaped society. Merchants refused to travel at night, fearing the king's twisted form would lurch from the shadows. Mothers sewed charms into their children's clothing, and soldiers refused to patrol near the old palace grounds, leaving it to rot into a haunted ruin, its windows shattered, banners decayed, and halls echoing with winds that locals swore carried the sound of tortured laughter. Famine and plague returned as they often did in those centuries, but unlike other kingdoms that blamed weather or disease, this realm blamed the curse, for every misfortune was tied back to the king's hideous shadow, and soon even newborns with deformities were declared marked by him, their existence used as proof that his spirit still tainted the blood of the nation. The greatest irony was that the nobles who once conspired to erase him found themselves forced to keep his memory alive in order to explain the chaos that followed, turning his name into a forbidden whisper that only grew louder with fear, and thus his monstrous visage achieved a dark immortality far beyond what any living king could claim. For in the eyes of his people, he had become not just a ruler of flesh, but a ruler of nightmares, a sovereign who commanded from beyond the grave, shaping the destiny of an empire long after his bones were locked away in stone. Centuries after the cursed king's bones were sealed in darkness, his story refused to die, passed from trembling lips around firelit hearths, whispered by monks who copied forbidden chronicles in hidden ink, and immortalized in murals that villagers painted on crumbling chapel walls despite royal decrees to erase his image, for people believed that forgetting him entirely would only anger his spirit further, and so his presence survived not in stone statues or royal records, but in superstition, evolving into a warning that rulers ignored at their peril. New kings who rose to power found their reigns haunted by his legend, with every famine, every failed harvest, and every sudden death at court blamed on his restless spirit, until one monarch, desperate to prove his strength, ordered the monastery crypt unsealed to display the body as nothing more than rotting flesh. Yet when workers opened the ancient stone, they recoiled in terror, for instead of dust and brittle bones, they found the corpse disturbingly preserved, flesh hardened like blackened leather, nails long and claw-like, teeth still bared in that eternal scream, and though the body did not move, those who gazed too long swore its chest rose and fell as if drawing shallow, mocking breaths. A vision so horrifying that the king who ordered the desecration fell ill the next day and died before sunrise, sparking panic that the curse had awakened once more. From then on, rulers learned to speak of the king only in hushed tones, commissioning priests to chant endless vigils in abandoned halls, while peasants left offerings of bread and coins at ruined palace gates, turning his memory into a twisted form of worship, half fear and half devotion, until his name became more powerful in death than it had ever been in life, a spectre that united nobles, priests, and peasants in terror. Centuries blurred, empires collapsed, and nations changed. But the tale persisted, resurfacing whenever someone stumbled upon records of a hideous monarch, whose jaw jutted forward, whose eyes burned with unnatural fury, and whose burial was marked by screams that no soil could silence. Skeptics dismissed the story as folklore, yet even they struggled to explain why villages near his old capital still suffered strange blights, or why travellers claimed to hear scratching beneath the earth on nights when the moon hung red. The chilling truth is that whether the curse was real or not no longer mattered, because the king's legend had embedded itself into the very soul of the land, feeding off fear, belief, and repetition, growing stronger with every retelling until the line between man and myth dissolved, and the once mocked monarch became something far more enduring than flesh and blood. He became a phantom sovereign, a ruler of nightmares whose throne lies not in gilded halls, but in the shadows of memory, where even today his hideous visage lingers as a reminder that some kings are not remembered for their power or glory, but for the terror they unleash upon the world long after their last breath.